Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is Jon Hjembo, Senior Manager at Telegeography. Jon is our expert on data centers. You might recall him from the Telegeography Literally Explains Data Centers episode. Even since recording that about a year ago, much has happened in the data center space, particularly with the present and coming booms of data centers due to the growth of AI. So I wanted to have Jon on to help us answer some common questions that we would get, such as what is the next data center hub? Where should data center operators expand? How do various data center markets compare to each other around the globe? Jon is going to explain our new market connectivity score that's a part of our data center product and explain why and how he and the infrastructure team have put it together to answer those and many other questions about global data center development across thousands of markets, which is really fascinating. I also wanted to ask Jon what markets our tool and his research indicate that are really hot or exciting right now. And frankly, I was a little surprised to hear his answers on this, so I'll leave that to the interview. We also look forward, as I always like to do, a bit and see what Jon thinks is coming down the road in the data center space in the near future. There's a lot to cover, as always, so I will get right to the interview. Enjoy. Welcome back to Telegeography Explains the Internet, Jon.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be here.
Now, Jon, it's been a little bit since you've been on the show. I guess the last time was our Explainer series, but could you remind listeners of what you do here at Telegeography?
Yeah, sure. I'm part of the infrastructure research team. And so I do research on international network development with Alan Malden and some of the other folks here. And I also head up our data center research at Telegeography.
And that is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. Data centers are such a hot topic. Okay, so AI, when other people talk about AI, Jon, they're talking about how is it going to affect the economy, replacing jobs and all this. What you and I think about is what is it going to do to bandwidth demand? What is it going to do to power demand? What is it going to do to data center location, right? How is it impacting the way that all of this ecosystem works? Because to me, one of the biggest impacts of AI is the amount of data that has to be stored somewhere and move around and be close enough to work in the latency that's required on whatever AI application that is. So a lot of folks out there in our industry are thinking of it this way and thinking about where do data centers get built? Why do we decide to build data centers in a particular location versus another? How does that get connected to fiber? That's all a huge topic, and we're going to take a slice of that today by looking at something that you and some of our colleagues at Telegeography have developed called the Market Connectivity Score. So, Jon, first, just what is the Market Connectivity Score?
So in a nutshell, the Market Connectivity Score is our answer to the question that everyone wants to know, where's the next big hub going to be? So, of course, it's a lot more than that. But what we're really getting at is what are the health indicators of markets around the world? So we take information from across Telegeography's research, along with some macroeconomic indicators, and provide scores of market health for 3,000 cities globally, looking across the spectrum at different aspects of the connectivity market.
And so when you say market health, just to get specific, you mean the health in terms of locating data centers in that market, having those data centers connected?
Yeah.
What all are you talking about?
Sure. Yeah. And it goes deeper than that. So by way of background, there's a lot of incredible research out there on data centers, as we all know. Telegeography is very unique in its coverage of the network market. Uh, it the data center market, there's a lot more competition out there.
Hmm.
But what the market connectivity score lets us do is harness the full power of
Mm.
telegeography's unique research base to give a broader picture of why you develop what you do, where you do, and to give you a picture of where the gaps are in the market. So the basic premise is, you know, data center markets don't develop in isolation. You hear all this news about where data centers are going. They're not going there just because these are where these buildings are, and they and people are following each other into these specific places because their competitors are there. It's
Hmm.
because there's a complement of different types of communications infrastructure verticals that are working together to create a better interconnection ecosystem. So you have to look at the data centers, the internet exchanges, the cloud, on ramps and regions, the network competition, the overall transparency in the markets. And this is what the MCS does. We take 9 different uh, metric groupings like data centers, network, transport network, local access, network pricing, cloud, internet exchanges, and so forth. And within those groupings, you have different clusters of metrics, 43
Hmm.
metrics overall, to give
Wow.
you a sense of what is actually going on in these markets. So it gives you a much broader perspective of the data center market, but also the overall interconnection ecosystem.
Hmm. So, how did you and the team assemble all this? Was this all data that telegeography is collecting for other kind of silos that we have, or is there outside data involved as well?
Yeah, it's mostly data that we're already gathering. There are a couple of third-party indicators.
Hmm.
Um, so when it comes to regulation and governance uh, and and energy indicators, which comes from the Global Energy
Mm.
Monitor, there are a
Right.
couple of other open sources involved, but for the most part, this comes directly from our other research silos. So as you indicated, we're pulling basically top level key metrics from research that we're already gathering for other products, from our cloud and WAN research, from our data center research, pricing, transport networks, and our global comms database. So research that. So basically, if you have access to this product, you're tapping into resources from across, a half a dozen other telegeography products as well, to
Right.
get a stronger sense, to get a unique telegeography perspective on the strength of interconnection markets.
Hmm. I have to say, John, I haven't worked on this at all. I work, sort of tangentially on some of the input data here and there, but I haven't. I've only seen this a couple of times. I've seen Tim demonstrate it, for example. So it's really fascinating to me to see exactly what you're saying, where there are a lot of discrete data sets that we have collected for a long time that have their own individual use cases. And for a while at Telegeography, we've had this idea that there's more we can do with putting those discrete data sets together to find new insights. On my side of the house, I do that with like a WAN market size, for example, that pulls in
Yep.
things. So I love to see this. I think it's really fascinating. I'm I've seen this kind of spider web chart that we have. There might be a term of art there that I'm missing, but
Yeah, I
can
think you're
can
talking
you
about the
describe
polar
that?
charts.
What is it called?
A polar chart? Yeah.
Polar chart. Okay, well, that makes
Yes.
sense. Okay, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
it looks like a spider web. So please, everybody,
Yes.
forgive me. But so, how do
Me
you
too.
take all those parameters and end up with this visual? And everybody will drop a link in the show notes and things so that you can see this.
Yeah.
But yeah, so how do we weight all of those parameters and toggle through them for you to come to a conclusion that is bespoke, if you will, because
Yeah.
we're not just telling you this is the best market, but you can
Right.
tune this, as I understand, to
That's right.
what is important to you, right?
Yeah. So the tool is. basically an interactive table with chart visuals as that are a part of it as well. But the table allows you to look at comparative scoring or nominal values for different categories. You can toggle
Mm-hmm.
between the actual values, like the actual data center capacity, actual number of data centers in service, the actual clean power capacity planned for a market, for example, things like that. Or you can toggle to the score. The score for each of the 43 metrics that we track within the 9 metric groupings is between 0 and 100.
Mm-hmm.
And, the top of the 3,000 markets, 100, the bottom 0. And in order to get the relative score, you take your nominal value and divide that by the difference between the max and the minimum value for that metric to get the
Mm-hmm.
percentage difference, and that's your score.
Gotcha.
So that's your score. So within each of the metrics, there is there's going to be a 100 and a 0 somewhere. But when you get to the metric groupings, it's averaged together. And then when you get to the overall score, that's an average of each of the metric groupings. So, like the very top score, when you look at those polar charts, the top score may be relatively, it won't be 100 probably. No, in fact, it's definitely not. It's going to be in the upper 60s, I think.
Right.
But it's an average of all of this. And it shows that not every market is, no market is perfect. No market is
Right.
perfect. So, when you look at those relative scores, you see that. But you can weigh each of the parameters too. So, the all the parameters default to the same weight setting, which is a 2 out of 4. But if you decide you want to put more stress on, you're more concerned about governance and
Mm-hmm.
transparency. You
So
can,
let's say you have sensitive data, you're in an industry where
yeah,
compliance is really important. You can say,
yeah.
hey, this trumps fiber availability or something to me, right?
Absolutely. Then you would just, there's a slider scale. You just push up the weighting for the weight measure for governance, and then you can actually see the rankings shift
Mm-hmm.
dynamically as you do that, and that can be incredibly relevant in cases where look at Southeast Asia now, where um, investors are scrambling to look outside of Singapore for other near term growth because um, growth is so constrained in Singapore. Well, you got a
Right.
lot of volatile markets in Southeast Asia, so if you're more concerned about that, you would ratchet up the weighting for governance. If you're not, if you're looking for availability of clean power or planned clean power, if you're looking for the near future and saying, I want to go somewhere that I know there will be access to clean power in the near future because they have projects planned, you'll ratchet up the weighting for that, and you'll evaluate that measure instead. So it all depends what you're looking for. But yeah, the weighting allows you to tailor your search to what's most important to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. All right. So that's the tool. And like I said, probably it requires some looking at it to fully imbibe everything that you're saying. So I encourage listeners to do that. But having made the tool, now I want to talk a little bit about what it tells us, right? So you mentioned 3,000 different markets. So let's
Yeah.
start there. If we're covering 3,000 different markets, I'm taking from that we're moving well beyond the Ashburn, Frankfurt, Singapore, Tokyo kind of
Oh, we
view of
are.
the world into something that might be much closer to what we think of as edge data centers. Is that the case?
Yeah, definitely. And as we begin working through this with customers, we're finding some fantastic reinforcement of what we already are leaning towards in terms of where the opportunity is as we look at the results of this thing. But we're also finding some interesting new nuggets as we delve into it. Um, so when you're evaluating so many markets, it's easy to get distracted by outliers too. So there are multiple filters in the tool to allow you to
Mm-hmm.
narrow things down to what's really relevant as well. So if you want to look at like secondary markets in Asia that are fast growth and then ranking by fastest growth, you might quickly get into an area where like the 2000th ranked market is growing
Hmm.
exponentially or something like that. So you
Right.
filter those results out, and then I've done this a number of times and looking at this with clients, and then you see this, you magically see this amazing list pop up as you filter down
Hmm.
to what's relevant, and you see places that are really relevant, and you can see why they're relevant. You can see where perhaps data centers haven't really taken off yet, or perhaps cloud presence isn't there yet, but you see a competitive local network ecosystem. You see a lot of ASNs in this market. You see a lot of
Hmm.
international internet capacity in this market. You see competitive pricing or something like that. There are different you can isolate the factors that show potential in different markets as you look through this.
Right. And so the idea is, in part, it has, I think, I reckon a lot of ideas here, but is to look at that longer tail to a place that maybe others haven't quite thought about that market yet, and see where
Sure.
there's this big potential for growth. I mean, so
Yeah.
I live, as some listeners might recall, I live in Loudoun County, right? So just the other day, my eighth grade twins were taking a standardized kind of test, and I had to drive to this high school to drop them off. And what is across the street from this high school? Like a brand new data center, right? So
Of course.
so much development has been focused on places like Ashburn, where you have the
Yeah.
network effect or whatever. But I
Yeah.
also have noticed that in rural Virginia, there are more data centers going up and whatnot. So you're able to look at, okay, well, there's certain markets that aren't going to be on anyone's mind, but that might have a real sort of jackpot of factors to look into, basically.
Yeah, and we've seen some examples like that too. So, in addition to looking at the overall scores, the market connectivity score allows you to look at to specifically evaluate fast growth markets by four specific metrics, and that's
Hmm.
data centers planned, cloud regions planned, um, subsea cables planned, and clean power planned.
Mm-hmm.
So So this isn't like long-term forecasting. This is like concrete near-term planned
Right. These things
development.
are underway. It's
They're
not like
underway.
speculative, like we
It's not
know that we're going to
speculative.
get a cable, we
Exactly.
know that we're going to get a clean power plant or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, one example of this, and of course it's one of the more obvious examples in a way, but when you look at our overall fastest growth markets right now, Kuala Lumpur comes out on top. Now,
Mm.
that may
Interesting.
make sense, but some people might say, why not Johor Bahru, right?
Hmm.
That's what we've been talking about. It's this demand spilling over directly into Johor.
Right.
But if you look at the difference between those two markets, ultimately, if you look at the big picture, Johor is well, they're both closely tied to demand in Singapore,
Right.
but Johor is so much more so. And it's really isolated to
Because it's
building up
it's
the
like
data.
right across the channel
Yeah,
for people who don't know the geography. It's like
right.
literally you could see it from Singapore, right? So do I have
Right,
that right? Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it's right across the bridge. So you have all this data center development going on there, but it's completely tied into the orbit of Singapore. It's based on the demand for Singapore. Kuala
Hmm.
Lumpur, yes, also to some degree, but the growth that we're seeing there right now is more diverse. Like they're putting in
Right.
multiple full blown cloud regions in Kuala Lumpur right now. There are subsea cables that are planned to pop into to go to access Kuala Lumpur as well, as multiple data centers from different providers. So there's a lot more diversity there, and near term growth in Kuala Lumpur as tied to Singapore, but also having something of its own orbit and filling in the
Hmm.
chinks in the overall um, uh, interconnection ecosystem needs of that particular market. So that's an interesting example, but there are a lot of others too. I mean, um, Auckland is like really high up on the list of development right now because
Really, I would have had never guessed. Yeah.
multiple cloud regions going in there. So, Riyadh, Vienna. I mean, we're seeing both cloud regions and dark fiber being deployed into Vienna. That's a really core node for Southern Europe, for
Hmm.
kind of an access point for Southeastern Europe going towards Vienna.
Hmm.
Um, And so basically, we see a lot of gaps being filled in. But
Right.
here's what's really interesting in our findings. Like, as you see places like this, of course, Berlin too, as a secondary market to Frankfurt, it's going like crazy right now, even though there are regulatory issues that are kind of preventing the speed of development that I think operators would like to see.
Right.
Um, but what's really fascinating when we look at the fast growth markets, you see this confluence of new places where opportunities are being met. And yeah, they're going to take off in their own way. They're not going to become the next Frankfurt, but they're going to have like international investment come in, fill in the gaps in the IX development and cloud development and network and data center development. But then ultimately, the center of that data gravity always pulls back to the hubs, and it pulls both ways. It's this increasingly rich intermeshing of edge
Mm-hmm.
markets and the main hubs. So again, when we look at the MCS right now in the fast growth markets, two of the very fastest growing markets are Singapore and Frankfurt. So,
Right.
because it always comes back to that, and that's
Well,
despite
that's
the
to my
fact.
point earlier that living in this area, I
Yeah,
still see brand new construction of data centers in Ashburn that to use an astronomical metaphor, right? That if you have a very dense market, there's more gravity, right? So there's economic
absolutely.
gravity models, right? So,
And
yeah.
that's even despite the incredible hurdles and challenges that we're seeing in these markets right now. I mean, in big parts of Loudon, you're not going to be able to light up these new data centers until new transmission lines come on, but
Right.
they're still going to build them anyway. In Frankfurt, you're going to get this sliding scale of increased regulation to where you're going to have to rely on uh, sustainable energy, 100% sustainable energy for new development, and you're going to have to implement waste heat sharing. But there's still tons of
But
new
it's
development in the
worth
pipeline.
even
They're
going
going
through
to
those
they're going to do
hurdles
it.
because, yeah, because of the
It's worth
network
going through the
effects, right? So,
hurdles.
yeah.
Exactly. And same with Singapore. I mean, they have not figured out how they're going to handle the insatiable demand for data center capacity in Singapore going forward. They
It's a small island.
It's a small island with very limited power, and they just slowed the new capacity development to a drip at a time when the demand suddenly exploded because of AI.
Hmm.
So they have a major problem there. But
Right.
despite that, they're still one of the fastest growing markets on our list, not
Hmm.
because we're not just looking at the data centers, we're looking at all of this demand together. And what we see there is more subsea cables in the pipeline than anywhere else in the
Hmm.
world. And what that tells
Hmm.
us is that no matter what they can figure out in terms of how to implement um, controlled growth in the data center market itself, the demand for that interconnection is still going to be driving towards Singapore. It's not going to go to the demand is not for Johor. Johor's
Right.
demand is for Singapore. The subsea
Right. It's to
cable
serve the
connectivity
right.
demand is for Singapore. So yeah, that's what this data reflects, and I think it's really fascinating to see that.
And just to flesh that out for everybody and myself, right? That the reason that matters so much is because even in the AI world, so much of these applications are basically latency sensitive. Is that the main
Yeah.
driver why these markets have such a pull on the other smaller markets?
Yes, that's part of it for sure. I mean, it's all the traditional demand, it's the cloud demand, it's the enterprise demand, and the AI is definitely a part of that. Is a component there, and really the degree to which that the AI deployment affects network and data center deployment, we're still ironing that out, but it's
Hmm.
definitely a key component there. It adds fuel to that gravity. And I mean, when you look at the two aspects of AI deployments, you have your training models and your inference, your work models.
Hmm.
Training models hypothetically can be deployed to slightly more um, latency insensitive places where power
Right.
might be more available, cheaper, and all that. But then, there's all this discussion about how much how much latency do you need to have between the training and the inference models, and how often do you need to update training models, and so forth and so on. But ultimately, when it comes to the inference models, that's going to add to already insatiable demand in the
Right.
biggest markets, because you have to have the ultimate AI applications close, in very close proximity to the end users.
And so then it's about latency, but then also just layers 1, 2, and 3 physical network itself, right? So the reason that I would have trouble dropping a data center in North Dakota, where my power costs are going to be pretty low and my real estate costs are negligible, is because no one has massive fiber ducts
Yep.
into rural North Dakota, right? So
Absolutely.
obviously we're taking that into account, but do you see in the results how much that is a factor in all of this opportunity as well? Or an adjunct to that question is, if I'm a fiber provider of whatever stripe, right? In the US, for example, we have some infrastructure bill money headed toward fiber development. Should I be looking at this to think about where I might want to build fiber routes? Right?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I would think so. And I mean, that's one of many questions that you could ask, as you look at this tool. And if nothing else, it would provide a preliminary glimpse of your answer, and
Mm-hmm.
where to go from there, in terms of finding further answers. But I mean, you can look at, for example, at where there is network availability and competitiveness, but a complete lack of infrastructure resources. And I mean, if I was, I mean, I guess if I was a data center operator that was looking for a latency, a place that didn't require low latency for
Mm-hmm.
like a training AI data center, I'd be interested to know where there was plenty of network available, local access, where there
Right.
was abundant power, but not necessarily a ton of competition.
Mm-hmm.
That would be intriguing for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So in other words, there's a lot of ways one could slice and dice the
Yeah,
question: where should data center markets go, right? So that there's a
yeah,
very big difference in kind of what your goals are, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it varies for every user. And I mean, like I said, when you're looking at this confluence of IX and cloud and data center and network, there are a host of customers that are interested in different aspects of those markets that can isolate any one of those parameters to see where the
mm-hmm.
gaps are, to see where the weaknesses are, or to see where the strengths are, and
Right.
to figure out what they want to do from there.
Yeah, because two anecdotes here that I remember from long ago, right before hyperscalers were even really a thing and stuff like this. I remember one uh, nascent hyperscaler dropped a data center in a landlocked place in South America that had no access to massive fiber ducts or submarine cables or anything like
Yep.
that, and it was kind of a head scratcher at that time. And at the same time, when power was starting to be, again, this is a long time ago, power starting to become the real currency of that realm, that people saying, oh well, Iceland, geothermal energy, and it's cold
Yeah.
and all this. And at
Yep.
the time, again, Iceland was poorly served by submarine cables. I don't think it's particularly super competitive even at this time.
No.
So as I always say, because I'm a network guy or whatever, it's the network is always kind of the last thing that people consider when they're making these kinds of decisions. But that's precisely what you can sort of balance equities
Yeah.
on across our data, because we're the network people, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what makes all the difference. And yeah, that's our unique value right there, and what
Mhm.
gives us, I think, uh, a very special perspective into the data center market compared to other good resources that are out there.
All right. So, John, to wrap us up, I'm going to put you on the spot here and say you are a data center expert. You really weave this, I'm sure, through all of your answers. But let me have you laser beam on, if I'm in the data center market, what am I looking toward in the next couple of years, the near term horizon? What is important in data center development throughout the mid 2020s here?
Yeah, a couple of things. Um, Above all, power is
Hmm.
uh, absolutely key to everything.
Not just
And
power availability and price, but also the degree to which it might comport with various countries' sustainability goals and things like that.
yeah, yeah, we're having this confluence of all kinds of challenges when it comes to power. We need all the power. The industry needs all the power it can possibly get at a time when power is less available, and
Hmm.
government regulators and utility companies are having a very hard time figuring out how to support sustainable development in the data center industry going forward, and balancing the needs of that industry with all the other users of utility power. So what we're seeing is this shift where data center operators are going to have to take a much more proactive um, um, plan of action when it comes to sourcing their power, and not
Right.
just deploying close to transmission lines, but deploying uh, where power is generated, perhaps taking the initiative
Mm.
to to form their own power generation, which is all the solutions that we're looking at in the next few
Yeah.
years are
Yeah.
really challenging. There's a lot of things being kicked around. There are operators that are talking about building their own clean power generation,
Hmm.
deploying with nuclear. And even in this past week, we saw some major setbacks for hyperscalers that were deploying, trying to gain nuclear power generation capacity. So there are major challenges ahead when it comes to this, but that's where a lot of the attention is going to be focused. We hear about small modular reactors being deployed on site with data centers, but the fact is that is a technological solution that's still a little ways off from really being fully developed.
Hmm.
And in the interim, it's going to feel like a lifetime waiting for that to come online so that they can actually rely on SMR. So
Right.
what we're going to see in the next few years is a lot of soul searching and a lot of scrambling and figuring out how to do this thing sustainably going forward. And in the meantime, there's going to be heavy reliance on fossil fuel generation
Hmm.
as we await more clean power alternatives. The other thing is that with AI becoming a bigger thing, I think we're ultimately going to have to look at a lot of smaller deployments, more
Hmm.
smaller deployments as opposed to fewer
Right.
very large deployments, because the sheer amount of power that will be demanded for AI, for individual chipsets, for clusters, for AI focused data centers is going to be so staggering that we're going to have to look at ways to split these deployments out further in order to not overtax resources in one particular area.
Right. At the risk of getting way too far afield from my depth of knowledge, but I take it that whereas in telecom there's almost no limit to the volume of data as long as you have fiber and transmission equipment, there are some physical limits with power that just aren't able to be overcome. You know what I mean? So that
Yeah,
you're
that's
saying
absolutely right.
distribute the power generation
Yeah.
much more widely, and then distribute data centers along with that,
Yeah.
rather than focused. Yeah, it's interesting, John. I want you to come talk to my son and convince him of this because he's really interested in physics and like kind of theoretical physics or whatever. And I
Yeah.
keep saying like, hey, maybe you should go into energy. That's physics
Mm.
role that has a pretty bright future compared to contemplating how quantum mechanics works or whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a limiting factor.
Mhm.
And honestly, the chipset development for AI is far outstripping the ability of data centers to support, full
Right.
utilization of these things the way they would like to.
Yeah, and that's another place where what we do and what people who listen to this podcast do on a daily basis is so fascinating to relate to the real world, that to the layperson's mind the AI, which just is in the cloud, is just there. it's not a physical thing that
Yeah.
requires resources. It just exists on its own. It is virtual. It is not. Every single interaction that you have with Chat GPT or whatever requires a physical location that is connected with wires, that is sitting on real estate, that has 24/7 monitoring and all these things. They
I
do
think if
not
we could
happen.
physically envision the amount of resources that these cloud resources are utilizing, it would be really. I think we would all be shocked.
Yeah, for real, for real. I mean, periodically throughout our long tenure at Telegeography, we've had reporters ask us, kind of silly questions that are fun, nonetheless, to think about, like how much does the internet weigh and stuff like that, right? And I think even those are fun to think through, and just thinking about the real world dimension of all of these sort of
Yeah.
digital things that we take for granted, and that is, I take it,
Yep.
precisely what you can do with this tool. Basically, is figure out how to balance all of those things toward developing that physical environment. So this has been really
Yeah.
interesting, John. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
So to wrap things up, I mentioned that we'll drop, of course, links to this in the show notes. If listeners are like me and they're usually listening to a podcast whilst engaged in some sort of other activity, whether it's washing dishes or mowing the lawn or whatever. Can you just tell us how they might find you and the connectivity score? Have you blogged about this recently or something?
Yeah, we'll have to put this URL onto the podcast if we can. But
Mm-hmm.
so there, the MCS itself, the tool itself, is embedded within the data center research service. So if you have access to that product, it's prominently displayed there, and you can
Right.
access
So that's
that.
behind a paywall. If you're
That's
already
behind the
in the data
paywall.
center, you can
But
see, then you can just jump in and see the tool. Right.
Right. But for at least a basic update of what's happening overall, we will quarterly be posting a dashboard of
Oh, cool.
top 10 markets overall, along with the
Mm-hmm.
top 10 growth markets, and they're going to have those awesome spiderweb charts on
Yes.
them as
Okay.
well. So the
Which I now
pillar
know are
charts will be
actually
there.
called polar charts. Polar charts.
Polar
That makes
charts,
it. Yeah.
yeah. So
Okay. Yeah.
so the URL for that is basically our website /market-connectivity-score.
That's nice and easy. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Excellent. All right, John, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Cheers. Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.